Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi.
I'd like to ask you a little bit about your military service.
Well,
Uh, what, you were in the Army?
yes, in
What
the Nurse Corps,
Nurse Corps, and what, did you have a particular unit? Um,
36 General Hospital, which was the Wayne University out of Detroit, Michigan.
huh,
I think I was working in Newberry, Michigan in the UP when Pearl Harbor came along and everybody rushed to enlist. And being from a patriotic family, I thought the only thing to do was do my share. So I enlisted in January 1942, and my friend, who was in training with me, enlisted at that time herself.
who was that?
Uh, BJ South. She was an only child, so it must have been a considerable shock for her family, but they accepted it. Um, then I came down home and did private duty while I waited to be called into active duty, and we got our orders about in June and didn't go to the Army till about August or September of that year when we went to Colorado Springs. The Army was kind enough to give us a roomette on the train, and trains were big in those days. That was the only time I ever had a roomette. Um, and so we traveled out to Colorado in good style and were assigned to barracks where we each had a private room but community bathroom. Um, I don't know, I suppose there was about at least 32 living in a barracks. And we learned our way around quite soon. We were shortly issued uniforms. They were the navy blue kind, which are historic and they don't use them anymore, and white uniforms. And learned our way to the mess hall every day in the morning, say about 6 o'clock, if not earlier. We had calisthenics outdoors, which was fine until the winter, and it was not so fine then. Uh, and we worked in the station hospital on various wards during the day and had indoctrination classes, and we adjusted quite well to the area. Colorado Springs was a beautiful town uh, with lots of things for the service people to do. We had movies on the post. I don't recall that we went to any, but the thing we liked to do best was go to dances if there were any. And the mess hall was a big place and crowded, and the meals were very good. We got a lot of sea scallops, which was the first time I had scallops, and we had them often.
Hmm.
But we lived through that too, and the calisthenics and exercise and marching and learning drills was quite time consuming. And then we went on a 5 mile hike, and my roommate or friend, she lived in a different room, she wore huaraches, and by the time the march was over, she was about dead from the feet up to her knees.
How did
But
she happen to wear those?
well, At this time, nothing was better than to be out of Army uniform. If we could be out of uniform, that was a chance to be unregimented for a few moments, but it was few and far between that you could do that.
Did you start out as a second lieutenant or
Yes,
something
yes.
less? You were sworn in as a
Because
second lieutenant?
I had a degree,
Yes.
and that probably was the only reason.
Uh-huh.
And then I was assigned to teach corpsmen nursing procedures and nursing, which was a challenge because nobody was interested. They didn't care. I guess I cared enough, but it was pretty uphill, and I really don't know how much they learned from me. But when we were overseas, we had such good crewmen. I would put them up against almost any more nurse. They were excellent and good to the men. So they must have learned everything someplace. The men that we trained didn't necessarily end up in our outfit. There were many, many nurses there from different outfits also. But there was a corps from Detroit of doctors and nurses, and they chose the other personnel from a pool, probably. Well, we continued there for some months during the winter, and I really hardly remember when we went overseas, but first we went on bivouacs and field training for a couple of days or more at a time. Probably we didn't learn much on those excursions. But finally we got ordered to Fort Dix in the east, which was our staging area.
New Jersey?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the outfit was added to and changed, but we two stayed together. There was one other girl from Kalamazoo, Betty Lambert, whose brother lives across the ravine from you. She was a good friend and still is one. So at the staging area, we slept in 3 deep bunks. And it was a huge barracks. I suppose at least 1,000 people in it, all nurses.
Wow.
And you did not get any sleep ever while you were there because something or other was going on all night long. When we finally got our gear together, we had an A bag and a B bag, and were issued gas masks and helmets, which we had to take with us. So loaded down with gear, we then hurried up and waited. All the ships were going out in convoys at that time because the Atlantic was filled with German submarines, and it wasn't too safe. No boat went over alone. There were many troop ships, but this was one of the smaller ones, and the name was Susan B. Anthony. And we soon adjusted to shipboard. There, we just have double bunks. And the nurses were in one quarter, officers in another, and EMs probably down in the hole someplace. We had 2 meals a day, which were good, but soon it was sort of in the fall and the waters were getting rough. Nobody cared whether we ever had a meal or not. So we probably took about 2 weeks to get across the ocean, and of course, when you're in the service, rumors abound. By that time, the action was all in Africa, North Africa. So that is where we went, and we were headed for Algeria, which at that time was a French possession. And the last, uh, when we entered the Mediterranean, the action was quite warmed up. Planes flew all over every night, and you could go out and watch the tracer bullets the planes were left. And the last night there was a German raid on a convoy, and well, when they called general stations, everybody was electrified, and while the crew members on the boat rushed up to take their places on the guns. Before this, we had several lifeboat drills, of course, and were issued a life jacket. And on the night before, well, some people were cool and other people were hysterical. One girl packed her life jacket full of candy bars. One packed hers full of makeup because she wanted to look nice on the lifeboat. And we played bridge, probably not much bridge, and mostly talking. And the boat right next to us in back was sunk.
Oh.
But we made it into port of Algeria, and we're loaded onto these 10-ton army trucks. I think they called them 10-ton. And we were taken out to various tent cities. Our unit was scattered here and there, and we ended up outside of the city next to a cemetery. Well, it was a crudely put up tent city, and the only running water available to us was in the cemetery. So we used to go over there, get a helmet full of water. That was your bath if you took them, and we did. And that was your laundry too. You had to get water for your own laundry and do it and hang it up. Now, of course, things dried fast there because it was hot. And about the third day there, in the cemetery, I ran into a nurse who I had been in training with, and we lived a couple of rooms from one another, which was a vast surprise. Then, after a few days, we were sent to some tent hospital. I don't recall the number or the name, and put to work on. I think that most of the patients had malaria. We had to take antivenin, a medication, every day to keep from getting sick with malaria. It didn't cure the disease, it just masked it. So everybody thought they looked yellow from these pills, but I think not. So we were on a detached service, they call it. Meanwhile, the troops were invading Sicily successfully. And we kept working, and they finally entered the boot of Italy. And eventually, we went over to Italy on a British ship, which seemed luxurious to us. All the batmen or workers or stewards or whatever were English. They had huge, huge bathtubs, which you could take a bath in salt water. And you had a little basin about the size of a helmet filled with fresh water, and you could rinse off with fresh water and not have all the salt on your skin. Well, when we got to Italy, we were taken immediately to another tent city outside of Naples, Italy. And there we lived 6 people to a tent. Well, the tents were heavy green army material, and they had floors in it at least, and 6 army cots, and it was warm weather, and it was sandy and dusty there, so it wasn't too pleasant. But by that time, we had made some good friends and knew what we wanted to do and who we wanted to have as roommates when the time finally came. And as Naples is close to the sea, there were Navy ships in there all the time.
Is that where you landed, Naples?
Yeah, and all the officers came and invited the nurses back to see them on board. So most of the kids went because first you could have a hot shower, second you got a good meal, and you might have had a lot of fun and met some interesting people too. So that didn't last very long, and the place we were stationed in, Naples, was scheduled to be the site of a World's Fair in a couple of years, but of course that wasn't to be because of the war came along, and so they couldn't have the World's Fair. But the empty pavilions were around, loads of paintings and artwork, unframed, uncreated, just left there. And we picked a couple of oil paintings up, and one of my roommates had a picture of an Arab she's carried around all through Europe. I suppose she finally got rid of it. And there were loads of enlisted men around, and we weren't yet indoctrinated enough to get against EMs, because some of them were very nice. In fact, most of them. So we saw some of them, and we were on C or K rations by that time, and had been, so no mess halls. So one night we went out, and with a soldier's bayonet, there was a potato patch that had been abandoned. We dug up fresh potatoes and had boiled potatoes, which tasted delicious. And there wasn't much to do there. We could go into Naples at that time and look around. There was nothing to buy. You couldn't go out to dinner anyplace because even the natives didn't have any food. And you could always get a ride anywhere because of all the military transport around. So we looked Naples over and went in a big glass-covered gallery, which were filled with closed shops, and saw some of the places that had been famous in peacetime. And then we finally had to go to another staging area where we slept a couple of nights on the floor of some building, and then were moved on in these big trucks to a place called Caserta, Italy. This was the summer palace of the king of Italy. Um, we didn't see the palace for quite a while. In fact, I scarcely remember it. But we were housed in the cavalry barracks. The barracks were fairly good-sized buildings, 2 floors, balcony all across the front of the building on the top, and 4 people to a room. So my friend and I had become quite good friends with these 2 other girls by then, one from Detroit, one from Sault Ste. Marie, and remained friends lifelong. Well, by that time, we had been issued brown and white seersucker uniforms to wear on duty, which was a choice because they didn't get ridiculed like white starch uniforms, which was impossible to keep it in the first place. So our hospital wasn't set up quite yet. It was a 5,000 bed hospital, and that is a pretty good sized hospital for peacetime. So we had to help set up the hospital when it finally opened. There was a hospital there. The windows were about, say, 18 feet tall and closed by wooden shutters. I don't think they had glass windows there. And it was a long hospital, but it was not adequate because they had to build Quonset huts to add to the capacity of the hospital. Meanwhile, we had a mess hall, went to mess, but all we had there was dehydrated eggs and maybe Spam and all dehydrated foods, but at least it was better than sea rations. So we worked 10, 12, and 14-hour days there, and then you would come home at night and walk upstairs, and rats would run over your shoes to get away. Rats infested our rooms. You slept under mosquito nets because of the malaria was still prevalent in Italy too. So every night you had to get under your mosquito net and tuck it in because the mosquitoes would attack you otherwise. But we found out that was a good idea because that kept off the rats as well. There were rat holes in the perimeter of the room, and iron beds with straw-filled mattresses, very bad, and 4-legged wooden stools. So we turned the stools on their side and put the seat over the rat holes so that rats couldn't get out into the room. If you had any candy, it was gone. The rats ate it. You did not. And it was not a bad place because the weather was warm and we could go out on our own balcony. And there were many, many Army units close by, like tank outfits, Signal Corps outfits, and probably some Air Corps outfits. So it was a shortage of dateable girls, so you could have a date with a different person about every night of the week if you wanted to. Well, and still we persisted in being out of uniform as much as possible. we had a new chief nurse. I still don't think she was very capable, but she certainly kept track of every infraction of uniforms or anything else, and you might end up being confined to the post any length of time, depending on how bad the crime was, like a colored scarf or anything out of uniform. Well, she didn't bother us too much for the most part. And she had a spy system, I think. Well, there were a number of first lieutenants that were serving as supervising nurses that had, say, 500 patients under her care. We ended up on a ward of 300 patients. Half of them were URI, which included pneumonia, colds, bleeding noses, then another whole section of pneumonia. There was a lot of pneumonia. Then mixed bag of trench feet, malaria, serious cases of malaria. There are 3 different sorts of malaria, depending on the mosquito, and one is frequently fatal. Thank goodness we didn't have much of that type. So every morning we had to go on duty. We then had corpsmen, a great many, for all those patients. And this nurse from Kalamazoo, Betty Lambert, and I went down the lines every morning and started intravenous on the pneumonia patients. We had at least 3 ward officers, a major, and 2 captains. We made rounds of every patient every day, and they got their medicine changed or whatever. We also had something they call FUOs, fever unknown origin, and some gastric cases. And right away we got some patients that were headed for the interior zone and discharge. Well, we found one of them had access to liquor, so he always had a bottle. I never learned where he got it from, but he had it. And everybody drew night duty too, and that was a 12-hour night duty. And at night we went in a room and opened the shutters and saw the airplanes flying over and leaving tracer bullets. So you could follow the path of the plane with the tracer bullets. We didn't have any direct hits on the hospital, however. And we went along and, if possible, went to a dance every opportunity. And there were kids from all over the country and a lot of good dancers from New York City, the best. So we had some fun along with the hard work.
I heard that you were a pretty mean dancer too.
Well, I enjoyed it. We could go to Naples on our time off, which was few and far between, and you could always get a ride. So we went to Naples and the small towns around there, They had something to buy, and I bought a couple of things home. I always thought that people were selling them from their own homes to get some money. I suppose the black market was on, but we didn't bother with that. We did have a PX. The only thing you could buy there were shoelaces, shoe polish, cigarettes, and I guess probably candy bars, but I don't remember. So that was another place to go and spend some money. You could hardly spend any money over there. And the first New Year's Eve, that must have been New Year's Eve, 1943, there was a huge storm. All the tent hospitals and evacuation hospitals and forward hospitals in that field, there was one other, blew over. And the patients were out in the weather, which they took care of right away. And that night, we admitted over 100 patients to our wards. One ward, my ward, we got 300 patients. No, two. Overnight, we got 100 patients. You had to be so careful. Rank, name, serial number, and all that stuff had to be charted so you wouldn't lose a patient. Every so often they had inspection of your ward, and you had to account for every sheet, every piece of equipment that Army provided you with. So the ward master and the sergeants would borrow from ward to ward to ward to ward, and everything always checked out. Everybody was filled with quota and passed inspection that way. I can't tell you how good and compassionate the ward men were to the soldiers. We got quite fond of them ourselves, the patients and the ward clerks. Most of them were 18 and 19 years old, up in the front lines. When they got better, they knew they had to go back to the front lines. So you could hardly blame the militias much. I guess we finally hardened our hearts a little bit, because certain patients would come back and say, remember, and mention a name that was in the next bed or on the same ward. Well, he got killed at this place. At the time, the troops were fighting bitterly against the Germans at a river called the Volturno River, and it was named the Bloody Volturno. It was about sure death to be in a troop formation at that river. We got lots of casualties from that area. Of course, they all went to the surgery wards, which my friend BJ was serving on. I never was in those wards. I was always in medical wards. Among other people in the hospital were two infantry outfits. One was the 100th, the other was the 442nd. And our hospital took care of all of these soldiers. And their history was one of bravery, uncomplaining, and they were all Japanese Americans. So there was considerable interest in them. a lot of them were in for trench feet, and they had the reputation of being very brave and good soldiers. We got a lot of patients from the Volterno area, and then gradually the troops moved up the peninsula. And we no longer were one of the hospitals in the front, just behind the lines. We were getting casualties from further north, cases that were long-term that had to have additional surgery and go to some other spot or to be discharged and back to the States when they could get there. And so work became more routine and less exciting, but just as hard. While there, we went into all the small towns in the area, and we're lucky enough to get to Vesuvius. And after we went there a little while, Vesuvius erupted, and there was ash all over everything. Near the site, the ash was at least 3 feet deep. Everything was dirty, gritty, and the thing to do was get as close as you could to the action of the volcano, but I don't think we ever got there. But they did give us a leave to the Isle of Capri once. So we did get to Capri, which was a beautiful island and filled with various units and troops on recreation. And so we did get to the Blue Grotto. We went to another famous ruin, the Pantheon, which is in southern Italy, probably near the Adriatic seacoast, someplace. It was a beautiful remnants or relic, and no people anywhere around there. It just sort of sat out in the fields by itself. And we continued working, and finally the troops got up to Rome, and Rome fell. So we hitched a ride out of Piper Club and went up to Rome, a wall, for a couple of days. And it was easy enough to get up there, but it was so hard to get back. We finally got a ride with the British coming south. That was the only ride we could get, and we were very glad for that. And so we got back to our new unit, and only our closest friends knew we had been away, so we got away with that. This was about the time of the Anzio beachhead, and that was a big campaign again. We stayed in Sirte, where we were, and there were airstrikes from all the airfields in the south. And we sometimes, when we were off duty, could go and stand outside and watch the bombers and airplanes fly over on their way to bomb and fight at Anzio. Sometimes the ground just shook with all the plane traffic. It was very, very impressive and scary, and I never further got that, for one thing. The 82nd and the Big Red Fifth were two of the armies that were in Italy. And so, as we were marked Clarks, we had to go into France next. So we didn't have anything to do. Our hospital was closed to move. So for the first and last time in my entire life, I got a good suntan because that was all we had to do all day was lie in the sun and play bridge if we wanted to, and there wasn't much other entertainment. And then, of course, we went back on sea rations when our hospital closed. And for our trip to France, we were on another small British vessel with big bathtubs and fresh water to rinse off in. And the service was wonderful there. Well, I don't think we required much service, but if we did, we could have it. So we landed quite close to Saint-Tropez, France, down by the Riviera. Well, we landed at huge beach estate. All the beaches were still lined with barbed wire and other obstacles, so it wasn't safe to land in many places. And you couldn't go anywhere, and you had to stay with the nurses right in this small area and enjoy your sea rations. And then we got assigned, and they said they would set us up in a town called Aix-en-Provence in the south of France, a very famous town. And so we went there and had to set up from the beginning, set up iron beds, made the beds, set up the wards, got everything ready to go, and worked at least 14 hours a day. Everybody did. While we were there, we were living in an apartment house about 4 or 5 stories tall. Probably the elevator worked. I don't remember. I hope so. And the hospital was not big enough for the whole hospital to be under one roof. So all the medical patients were in one area, and across town was the surgical part of the hospital. So in other words, it became a logistic problem. Half the people were at one hospital and half the other. And you constantly were transferring medical patients to surgical wards for more treatment and vice versa. And it got so complex and unwieldy, we got the orders to close up that place. The next place we went to was quite a few miles north. And we set up another hospital at Dijon, France, where all your mustard comes from. It was a very, very old city. While we were in Aix, we couldn't see, we didn't have a chance to see anything. There are Roman aqueducts near there and a host of Roman ruins, but we didn't see anything but the wards and work. When we got to Dijon, we set up our hospital, and we were all under one area, and we spent quite a few months there. It was a nice town. We could go into town, but here again, you could not eat there because there weren't any restaurants open, and you couldn't buy anything there because there was nothing to buy. But we did get to a lovely spot, I suppose. It was a French estate in a mountainous area someplace for about a week, and all the nurses there, nobody else. But it was a pleasant place to be, and the scenery was beautiful. In fact, all the places we were in Europe were lovely, scenic-wise. Um, well, we stayed for a while in Dijon, but by now the time had come when all your friends were still back in Italy. You didn't know anybody there but the men in your own unit, uh, most of whom were married already. Uh, every hospital has an officers' club, of course. Nurses can go there. By that time, my roommate was engaged to the first sergeant of our whole outfit. Well, she wasn't even supposed to date enlisted men in the first place, so they finally got engaged. I suppose they snuck around and snuck out all the time, which made it more exciting. And they are still together and celebrated their 50th anniversary recently. When we left Dijon, and by that time, the fighting was past north of Dijon. I don't think they had liberated Belgium, Holland, or any of those places. But they did liberate Paris. We were too far from there to get any of the action of that. But we got to move to a suburb of Paris called Gauche. And there we were in a hospital which had been an American hospital, and lived in apartments a couple of hills away. And so we had high class quarters and a lot of steps to walk between places. By that time we were off C rations and K rations. Well, I haven't gone into the K rations at all, but we were on those sometimes. And in between places in France, we didn't go in trucks, we went on trains, which were some of the coldest places I have ever been in my life. The cars were unheated completely, and sometimes it was winter. Everybody was huddled in as many blankets as they could be. And at that time, we were eating K rations and didn't have anything even hot to drink. Everybody lived through it, but nobody ever forgot it either. It often was cold in Italy in the winter, and especially if we went to Mass in any of the old cathedrals or big churches in any of the cities, which didn't have any heat, of course. I think they had been cold for several centuries and never did get warm. And one happy day, we started getting fresh eggs from Denmark and fresh butter in the vessel. And that was enough to make everybody deliriously happy after over 2 years and so forth. So life improved in many respects. Nice quarters. Strangely enough, the bathtub was in the middle of the kitchen. I never could understand that, but all the apartments were just the same and had the bathtub in the kitchen. So when we were able to go to Paris, we got well acquainted with the subway. In fact, I knew it better than surface streets. And we were able to see the Eiffel Tower and the Louvre and Sacre-Cœur, which is a famous church on some high hill in France, and the Arc de Triomphe, and all the famous streets that you hear and read about. And we could buy perfume and costume jewelry there, which we never had a chance to buy in any of the other countries, which we made the most of and bought a lot. One time we went on leave up to Chamonix, which is in France, at the base of the Alp Mountains. And while we were there, again in rest and relaxation for about a week, we lived in a civilian hotel, not army quarters, and every bed had a little down puff on it, about a yard wide, which was fluffy and comfortable and warm. So we would try to curl up and have the blanket fit over us as much as we could cover. It was delicious. And it was so close to the mountains that the streams were white, or probably like you get from mountain runoff, and beautiful, beautiful scenery. And while there, we engaged in our only black market trading in our entire stay. Well, they sold jewelry there, and we were interested in anything to buy, but we couldn't buy them with money. We could buy them with cigarettes that you get in the PX. I guess they were for sale. They weren't given to us as a ration, I know. So we had to buy them, probably for not much money. And the jewelry we bought was Italian silver. Well, they were Italian jewelry rings, and they had colored stone sets, but probably it was glass. I never took one in to have it appraised. Amethyst colored and topaz colored, probably not real. I don't know. But the silver was at least Italian silver, because it had the sterling mark Italy uses on it. So we bought a few rings and didn't feel too guilty. And by that time, it was sort of a letdown being in the service. We were sort of used to everything and were wanting it over and ready to go home. And suddenly it was VE Day, which was a complete surprise, and everybody was overjoyed. We heard about it on our way to mess hall early in the afternoon. So there was jubilation, and suddenly another rumor that we were being sent to the CBI theater. The men and the hospital supplies would go first, and then the nurses would follow. They were to go through the Panama Canal and set up a hospital somewhere in CBI. So
CBI?
China, Burma, India,
Oh.
Pacific Theater. Well, we didn't like that very much, because by that time we had heard how much worse it was over there, and I'm sure it was, excepting for South Pacific, and that, of course, was a fiction. So we continued having our eggs and butter and delicious mated bread and so forth. And we continued our trips to Paris while we could, and every once in a while we would get an overnight pass to stay in Paris, and there was one hotel that we could go to, the Normandy, and it was near the Paris Opera, so it was in a convenient location. And all the sheets in that hotel were pure linen sheets. All the rest of the outfit left excepting the nurses, and the nurses were sent to Reims, France, which is the home of the famous cathedral. And we were in very poor barracks and had a mess hall and nothing to do. Was surrounded by mud, and there were 3,000 nurses there waiting to go someplace else. If you want to be in any horrible situation, try that. So we were there with nothing to do, played some bridge. Everybody started to learn how to dance or do whatever they could to fill up the time. We got back to Lourdes before we were due to ship out from home, and that glorious day we got on board ship and departed for the USA. It was filled with troops coming home. Everybody thought that would be the last war there ever was. And we again came to Fort Dix and saw the Statue of Liberty come in, and happily we're back in the States, and by that time found out we didn't have to go to the Pacific, so we were mustered out from Fort Dix and arrived home by the end of October 45. That's the end of the story.
Very good. You ended up a captain, is that right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I decided to leave the Army and not stay in service.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's quite a story. You have a lot of memories, don't you?
yes. And we never talk about it. Maybe if 4 nurses get together, we would say a few things, but very seldom.
Uh-huh.
And that's all.
Overall, what sort of experience was it for you?
I was glad to have done it overall, and I think everybody was.
Mm-hmm.
That I knew. We more or less remember the nice things or fun things.
In all that time, for instance, the sinking of the ship off of Algeria and so forth, you must have had some other scary experiences. Can you remember any particular scary experiences?
Well,
besides those you related?
It's scary being 3 people in the Piper Cub, if you have any sense. But it was sort of scary and concerning because the war was only a few miles away at that time, and anything could have happened.
Sure.
Fortunately, didn't.
You were really in the front lines during a lot of it, weren't you?
In Italy.
Yeah.
Not after that.
Mm-hmm. You could hear the shelling and so forth? And,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Or well, we imagined
One time
we
you
could if.
feel the ground shake.
Oh well, that was when they were bombing Anzio.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth.
Thank you for
It's
your patience.
This has been Elizabeth Gibbens giving us her recollections of her experiences as an Army nurse during World War II. It's April 26, 1997. We're in Josephine Russell's home in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Well, thank you for
That was what we now
having
call
you
WWII.
us perform.